Okay, back to what causes autism. And this is a huge question mark that everyone would like answered, particularly parents of people who have autism. The Autism Society has chosen the puzzle as their metaphor because there are many moving pieces. If you think about a disorder like sickle cell anemia, the gene that causes sickle cell anemia is responsible for developing a protein, a beta globin, to carry oxygen throughout the cells. That gene has one job. There's one function that gets impaired. Autism affects things like behavior, speech, cognition, sensory processing, fine motor development. There are many, many, many genes that control those things. And over 1,000 of them have been implicated in being associated with autism. No, you can't establish causation, just a correlation. So some cases of autism are purely genetic. Only about 10 to 20% of the cases can be pinpointed to a particular syndrome or genetic region. Fragile X is the most common of them. It represents about 5%. Others have more complex causation. There is polygenic inheritance or epigenetic factors, but it is highly heritable, about 60 to 90% heritable. It's as high, if not higher than schizophrenia, which is linked to autism. It's kind of interesting. But there have been over 1,000 genes. If you've met one person with autism, you've met one person with autism. It is a wide category that describes a particular set of features that we already discussed. So, that having been said, the causation is not clear cut or simple. It is associated with advanced maternal and paternal age and family history of schizophrenia. Interesting in regards to paternal age, even though the sperm is continually produced throughout the lifespan, and so they're new cells, unlike the maternal oocytes that are, present in fetal life. Methylation changes as the father gets older from environmental influences do impact gametogenesis in the sperm and can be linked with autism. Um, Unrelated patients rarely share the same exact mutations. And that was an interesting finding that, there could be a million variations on a theme that affect how this disorder evolves. Gene variants and methylation factors account for abnormal signaling in the brain, seems to be sort of the biggest contributor. And de novo mutations are common when you look at the genomes of parents and compare them to the genomes of their children. There's usually a change at some level in some gene, and it's a de novo, first time ever mutation. Chromosome abnormalities. This is like a list. It came right out of your textbook. So some syndromes, Down syndrome, Turner syndrome, Klinefelter syndrome, Supermale syndrome, or Jacob syndrome, Angelman syndrome, Prader-Willi syndrome. Not every person who gets these syndromes will have diagnostic features of autism spectrum disorders, but some will. So it's a contributor. They seem to identify a lot of copy number variants. Those are those like changes in the bases, duplications, deletions, insertions, inversions. Single gene disorders like Fragile X or Rett syndrome, neurofibromatosis. These are other diagnoses, and part of the clinical features can include autism spectrum disorder. And then metabolic conditions like mitochondrial disorders, PKU, these things that we test for on the newborn screening, if they are untreated, will lead to changes in brain development that lead to the development of features of autism. Causes of autism environmentally, wow. If you want to spend, a lot of time studying this, there is a lot of research out there about different speculated causes of autism or contributory factors. At this point, most of it is just correlational. You are in that research course right now. You know that a correlation does not imply causation, just those two things happen more frequently together. Maternal diabetes and hypertension. The mechanism there is thought to be that this creates some level of oxidative stress on the developing embryo or fetus. When they look at population-wide studies, they see that children from places with heavy exposure to air pollution, pesticides, or heavy metals like lead do tend to have higher frequencies of autism spectrum disorder diagnoses. Drug exposures, this is kind of controversial. So terbutaline is a drug we used in OB for a lot of years. We still use it very limited extent. Certainly doesn't explain 1 in 44 kids, but terbutaline is associated. That is a drug that stops uterine contractions. So correlated doesn't mean causation. Could be that preterm labor that prompted the use of terbutaline or the uterine hyperstimulation. Those things cause the stress on the baby and cause some defect in brain signaling. Valproic acid or Depakote is a medication that is given for either seizures or bipolar disorder. It's associated with a lot of different developmental disabilities and congenital anomalies, cleft lip, cleft palate, heart defects, cerebral palsy, all associated with the use of valproic acid. It's not commonly given to pregnant women, certainly doesn't explain 1 in 44 kids. Acetaminophen is very controversial, but it is an area of investigation. Whether there was prenatal exposure or exposure in that critical period in infancy, 0 to 24 months. They're looking at it. I cannot say that there's really not strong evidence, but you guys are at the beginning of your career. You'll have to tell me 20 years from now what the good literature says. SSRIs have been implicated as the emphasis has changed on treating perinatal mood disorders, whether it's in pregnancy or when the mother is breastfeeding, with these selective serotonin reuptake inhibitors like Prozac or Celexa. Effexor is another one. There does seem to be a correlation between SSRI use in pregnancy and a later diagnosis of autism spectrum disorder in that child. Dietary deficiencies are under investigation: vitamin D, iron, zinc, copper. There's a few others, folate, B12, but nothing conclusive yet. It's thought that exposure to elevated steroids, that's why when we have maternal inflammation or stress and there's a release of cortisol, that is thought to maybe be neurotoxic to that developing fetus if it hits at that critical period in brain development. Sex hormones, this kind of goes along with the male brain theory that autism is like an enhancement of male traits. So if you're exposed to higher levels of testosterone, that would make sense. In terms of polycystic ovarian syndrome, ooh, I made a spelling error there. Let me correct it real fast while I'm talking. Hypoxia at birth. Hypoxia at birth is theorized to cause an insult to the brain that might be implicated in autism. For a while, oxytocin induction was considered a risk factor, not conclusive. Oxytocin is necessary for labor. If you're making it yourself, I think it was more the hyperstimulation and the stress that hypoxia to the baby that it resulted in. And then lastly, we'll talk about the toxic bucket theory real quick. Toxic bucket theory is, your body is meant to handle toxins. We're exposed to them all the time, whether they're bacteria, viruses, whatever, or chemical exposures. Our body's sort of meant to repair our DNA. It's meant to, detoxify things that could be harmful to us. Our liver is involved in that. It's theorized that for some individuals with autism spectrum disorder, that at some point those defenses were overwhelmed, and it happened at a critical period of development. Again, there's really the scientific evidence at this point does not point to a single cause. There are just correlated factors, so we'll have to see how it evolves. What does not cause autism? Vaccines do not cause autism. All of the good studies have not shown a clinically or statistically significant link between the administration of the MMR vaccine and the development of autism, even though that sort of happens at the same time for a lot of kids. But there was one study, unfortunately, and the data was falsified. It was done by Wakefield, who has since lost his license to practice, and he has been discredited. but that stigma of vaccines still lingers. And now we have autism plus measles, which is unfortunate. It is not caused by parenting. The prevailing theory in the 1950s was that it was a refrigerator mother who did not respond appropriately to her child. She wasn't loving enough and did not provide enough social stimulation, and the child brain development was aberrant as a result. It was horrible mother shaming involved there. And good parenting cannot fix autism, no matter how hard you try, no matter how much money you spend, and how many novel treatments you pursue. You really can't cure autism with good parenting. And people need to know that. They need to be let off the hook that this is a neurological disorder. You didn't cause it. You can't cure it. There are things we can do to help. But that's really the extent of what we know about the causes of autism. And I'm going to talk about trends in research. There's a lot of research out there, whole genome sequencing to identify hotspots for genes, so that we might at some point have some diagnostic information, a tool that we can use to make decisions. What are protective factors? Is there a dietary element that we can add, like folic acid with neural tube defects? Can we do something along the lines of omega-3 fatty acids, vitamin D supplementation? All of these things are under investigation, and we'll see how that evolves. It's proposed that some antioxidants might help with that toxic bucket. So they are investigating curcumin, and polyresveratrol, I think, was the other one that I read. And this is, relatively good science. This is current, and it's got large samples, but nothing, again, has been positively identified as being a magic silver bullet for any of this stuff. Identification of copy variants, those deletions and duplications, to see if we can, again, make better decisions in regard to this. And development of collaborative databases so that a researcher in Europe can connect with people in the United States or South America and find trends in the data that they can use in some clinically applicable way. And exploring the connection between ASD and other psychiatric disorders. If we find some common link, could we use treatments or things like that to sort of ameliorate or improve the outcomes with autism spectrum disorders? Support for individuals and families. This is our last slide. Early intervention services. As soon as a child is identified, and the earlier the better, they should really be put into programs that can help them develop social skills, speech, fine motor skills, regulate that sensory input in ways that are socially acceptable. And they may, at the more severe levels, we're looking at things like applied behavioral analysis, which is a very intensive type therapy. It takes about 40 hours a week, one-on-one, very expensive as well. But if a child needs it, they should be made accessible. When they age out of early intervention services at age 3, they should be referred to individualized education planning through their school districts. For social skills training, speech, occupational therapy, and special ed, they may need more support than the school district can offer them. And so we would refer them to Children's Hospitals, Autism Society of America, Autism Speak, connecting people with resources that help them pay for the things that school services don't cover, and helping people connect as they age out of the school system at age 18 for services and supports that they need. That has to happen. We probably need legislation that grants people access to services, and that might mean expanding Medicare and Medicaid. So that is, I believe, the extent of our lecture on autism. I hope you enjoyed it. We'll pick up with newborn screening.